Okay, well, welcome everyone to our first webinar. This is hosted by Language Dynamics Group, and this is just a free webinar that they've set up that we can broadcast across the country, and we're very thankful for you joining us. Today, we're just going to do a brief overview of how we might be able to actually not leave very many children behind and mean it. And I really like this title, even though it's really outdated in a sense, because nobody talks about leaving no child behind anymore. But I think conceptually it still works perfectly, and it relates very much to the research that we've been doing here at BYU and at the University of South Florida with Trina Spencer. So I'm hoping that today is helpful to you, and we're just going to get started. So we will get started. So this is our simple view of reading, and many of you probably already know this. I'm sure you do. This concept here, or this definition of reading, includes two major components: decoding and language. And they are conflated together to lead to the construct of reading, or the definition of reading. And I do use that word very carefully and deliberately, conflated, because they really actually are two distinct constructs, but we kind of compress them and force them together under the title of reading. And that actually leads to a lot of problems, which I'll highlight for you here in just a couple of seconds. Now, this, of course, is a very simple view of reading, and if you want to get into much more complexity, you can read Perfetti's work or some others. But I like this because for us, it's a nice conceptual framework upon which we can really just establish our conversation today. So one of the interesting things about this is that reading comprehension really is a language comprehension construct. And this is a study that we did just a little while ago where we looked at some students' ability to understand what they listen to, which is on the x-axis down here, and then also measure their ability to understand what they read. And this is a very clear pattern, right? So you've got a pretty strong correlation here, and it just simply indicates that essentially if children are receiving a score of 30 on listening comprehension task, their reading comprehension score is going to be very similar. We found that this held also for Hispanic students. So we looked at this across some students who are culturally and linguistically diverse. Now this has a very, very profound meaning if you think about it, because suddenly if I just step back for 1 second and we look at this definition, reading comprehension really is a language process. And speech language pathologists, who I speak with all the time across the country, are often wondering what their role really is in reading. And once you understand, though, just how foundational language is to the reading comprehension process, it becomes very clear what we have to offer. And we're not the only people, speech language pathologists are not the only ones who recognize the importance of oral language. This is coming right out of the Common Core State Standards. Children's oral language competence is strongly predictive of their facility in learning to read and write, listening and speaking vocabulary, and even mastery of syntax set boundaries as to what children can read and understand, no matter how well they can decode. And this is a crucial piece to understand, because really this highlights the distinction between the two constructs of decoding and language. You really could learn how to decode something reasonably well with fluency, yet not understand still what it is that you're decoding. Now, in the education world, it's recognized that language is important, and it's also recognized that language can be monitored, assessed, and treated in the early years, in preschool, kindergarten, first grade, even before children are taught to read, before we can even measure reading comprehension. However, and it may seem like I'm picking on my friends in the education world, but I do want to just highlight the way in which they've attempted to measure reading comprehension recently. And for those of you who are speech language pathologists, and for those of you who aren't speech language pathologists, it will probably occur to you that the approaches that we've taken to measure reading comprehension or oral language efficiently and quickly in our districts is lacking in validity. So I'll give you an example here. In a pretty common assessment that's administered to children across the district, they're asked to read a passage in 1 minute, and then the examiner asks the child to tell them everything that they just read. And in this process right here, and there's a little video link down below, I don't have time to show it to you, but what the examiner then does is listens to the child retell a passage, and then the examiner just simply counts the number of words that the child is telling back to them. And this is supposed to be some sort of index of comprehension. I mean, sure, maybe there's a peripheral relationship there and even potentially somewhat of a correlation, but just the ecological validity in and of itself is very lacking, right? Just the idea that measuring the number of words someone tells back to you is going to tell you how well they understood something is pretty questionable. There was some great work that was done by the Fuchs and Standino and others where they were really looking at this idea of how do we measure comprehension in children? What's the best way to do it? And Standino, who was a fabulous researcher in this area, wrote that clearly something like measuring a child's ability to retell a passage would be a stronger indicator of comprehension. But there were these, and still are, these expectations that we have in place, or these parameters in place that we have to be able to meet. For example, if we're going to monitor the language of children across an entire school district, we can't do these traditional speech language pathology assessments where you take a language sample, you transcribe it, you segment it into C units, and you spend all of this time. You can't possibly do that across thousands of students. So the researchers who really were the pioneers in this area thought, well, let's try something like reading fluency. And they did find that when they asked a second grader, for example, to read a passage, and they measured that student's fluency, mostly this, by the way, is measured in correct words per minute most of the time. When they did that, they found that there was a pretty strong correlation with children's ability to understand what they read. Now, of course, if we just take a step back, though, it's pretty clear that a second grader's reading generally fairly simple language, right? The passages that a second grader can read or a first grader are very simplified. And so the language there is not very taxing. Also, it's also not surprising that you'll find a correlation when the demands are like that, because children with intact language learning skills, they are asked to listen or read something fairly simple and understand it. Most of the children will actually be able to understand it. And it's really similar to this idea of if we measure hearing, that's going to be able to give us a pretty strong correlation of students or people being able to understand what they hear. This is the same idea with reading fluency, right? If you can access the code, the majority of people will be able to understand the code. This does break down, though, considerably. This is a study that we just did just this year. And we found that when children, these are second grade students and third grade students, and when they're asked to read a passage that is replete with academic language, more in line with what they are expected to read and understand in the schools, you can see that the relationship between reading fluency, which is down here on the x-axis, and comprehension breaks apart. In fact, there's really no meaningful relationship at all. Students who read 50 words per minute, for example, are just as likely to understand with points up into the 40s or 30s, as well as with points down here in the 5s and 10s, which is really low or just average or high. So there isn't a real meaningful pattern here between reading fluency and reading comprehension. In fact, here's another graph that we extrapolated from the data. And you can see that here, if you put the students here on percentiles, and these are quantile rankings. This is the 10th percentile, 20th, 30th for reading fluency. Students who read at the 10th percentile for reading fluency in third grade, they can understand, which is the y-axis here, they can understand what they read just as well as students who are reading at the 80th, 90th percentile and so forth. And this pattern holds for second and third grade. So let's be clear. The relationship between reading fluency and reading comprehension really falls apart the moment we ask students to understand academic complex language. So knowing this and acknowledging that we still really have a problem with comprehension and measuring comprehension, our researchers in the education world have tried to improve upon their ability to measure comprehension. Here's an example of what they've done with what's called mazing, where the student is asked to select one of 3 words. So, for example, where are you going, Dad? I ask excitedly. I wonder if something interesting is followed, happening, shuffling. The student is supposed to select the correct word here. I'm going to search for some deer, stop, pink. Would you like to come along? Who, want, wheel, take a trek in the woods, replies eating ground, Dad, and so forth. You can also see this with the ice station, the same idea. Lewis tried to push one more sweater into his bag. Mom told him it could get really cold in the mountains, delicious, remember. We really clearly, at least from an ecological validity standpoint, and actually really from other validity standpoints as well, including construct validity, we really are just not there yet as far as being able to monitor the progress of children's language and their comprehension. That's a pretty major problem because the way that comprehension actually is assessed at the state level or at the national level isn't something simplified like this, selecting a fairly obvious choice out of 2 foils, right? We're actually asking the children, what's the meaning of drift as it's used in paragraph 18? Or which detail from the story helps the reader understand the meaning of drift? Or asking students here at the NAEP assessment, what's the main purpose of the article? The article says that emperor penguins live in a barren world. This suggests that penguins live in a place where the children have to select the correct answer. Or think about how comprehension is actually measured in the real world. Here's an excerpt from Harry Potter. The language complexity in here is really something else, right? Hermione rummaged for a moment and then extracted from the pile a large volume bound in faded black leather. She looked a little nauseated and held it as gingerly as if it were something recently dead. You think about the language here that our students are expected to understand, and clearly the progress monitoring tools that we're using are not capable of tapping into whether these students are understanding what they're reading. Things get a little more complicated too. Here's one of my favorite passages from Frank Herbert from Dune. Think about the language that our students, once they move into middle school, high school, are expected to understand. A crystal blowing of sand touched the exposed portions of his face, bringing the scent of the pre-spiced mass. El Sayal, the rain of sand that brings the morning, etc., etc. You get the idea. So really the issue here is all about validity. Are we measuring what we want to measure? And are we treating all, what we want to treat? This is a very fair question, right? Because here's what's happening. Our students are moving along through the school and they're being administered these progress monitoring assessments for comprehension. Someone's counting the number of words they tell back, or someone is putting a lot of stock in their reading fluency, or they're asking the students to select a fairly obvious foil from a maze procedure. And a lot of the students are doing just fine on those aspects. But then suddenly they're administered assessments at the district level or the state level or the national level, which assess their ability to understand academic language. And all of a sudden our administrators and our teachers are completely shocked and not understanding at all why their students are not understanding what they read because their progress monitoring tools are indicating otherwise. This is a total mismatch of construct right there. You can see it's so incredibly clear across the country, and it's particularly resonant here with African-American children, Hispanic children, Native American students, where you've got 17, 20, 21% who are reading at grade level, and the remainder are not reading at grade level. And for the students that are not, quote unquote, culturally and linguistically diverse, you can also see that you have less than 50% of those students reading at grade level. And what we mean, harkening back to our original slide, by reading at grade level really is a comprehension task. And it's very tragic to say that it doesn't seem to matter. Notice that I had 2013 data up there. It doesn't really make much of a difference at all. These are Hispanic students from 1992 to 2013 on the NAEP assessment. And you can see that the blue and the black is the percent of students reading at grade level. We're making progress, but this progress is incredibly slow, and it'll take us about 120 years to get our students who are Hispanic just up to the monolingual peers level. And you know, you get these researchers like Judy Wurzel, who's a fabulous researcher, and they have quotes like this: "It feels very frustrating that we're not seeing the kind of change we want to see in improvements in reading achievement. And it's hard to understand why that's happening." Well, you know, it's actually not really that hard to understand once you've identified the problem, okay? And the problem is this: you're only going to have maybe an upwards of 18% of students with difficulty learning to decode across a population. That's a pretty high number, actually. It's probably lower than that. And children who are culturally and linguistically diverse, they don't have this disproportionate difficulty learning how to decode or read the words off of a page. Nakamoto, one of the references here, in 2007, she followed Hispanic children from kindergarten up to 4th grade and found that the Hispanic students learned how to decode or read words just like everybody else. It wasn't particularly or unusually difficult for them to decode, but the moment she started to measure comprehension, that's where the breakdown occurred. And let's be clear, if you have 80% of a population not meeting expectations on comprehension, it's not because of a disorder. So clearly there are other factors in play, like poverty or a mismatch from one culture to the next, from the home culture to the school culture, linguistic differences, disability. You know, this I realize is outside, or it seems to be outside the purview of the speech language pathologist. They tend to be incredibly focused on the very last point there, disability. But really we bring to the table, and I know I'm not just speaking to speech language pathologists, but I want to bring this to the forefront here, that they bring to the table something that a lot of other educators don't have, which is expertise in assessment of language and expertise in treatment of language. And if we recognize that language really is the foundational issue for most of the students in a school district when it comes to reading, the SLP's role can be very strong. Here's Hirsch. It's now well accepted that the chief cause of the achievement gap between socioeconomic groups is a language gap. Academic language is the pivotal skill repertoire for closing the achievement gap, and attention to it is nearly absent in primary grades. That's Snow and Uccelli. Trying to look at our Q&A here thing. I just want to make sure, please feel free if you have any questions to use the Q&A option to ask any questions that you have. I know I'm going pretty quickly here, but I'd be happy to pause and answer any questions. Okay. So what we're really essentially doing is building the case for language, and it's a case that's already been made, and it's a case that's already been recognized. However, you can notice in our schools that we have a pretty disproportionate focus on decoding. We have multi-tiered systems of support in place for decoding, and we have assessments in place for decoding across an entire school district. Our attempts, however, to do this for language have essentially failed. It's time, absolutely, to have a dual focus on comprehension and decoding. Our students deserve to be able to understand what they read. It's what is meaningful, of course. It's the whole purpose why we read in the first place. So how is it measured right now? Well, we're counting the number of words in a minute that someone tells back to us. We're using reading fluency, mazing, matching pictures. You know, none of them really reflect the construct that we're trying to get at, which is the comprehension of academic language. So also we have this little process in place where we typically wait until students can read with reasonable fluency before we really measure their comprehension. You know, that's very problematic because Lyon did some work not too long ago where he found that about 75% of first grade students who are struggling with reading continue to have difficulty in adulthood. There's a tyranny of time when it comes to early identification. It's necessary to identify reading difficulty early, and in this way, we can actually introduce preventative approaches. Waiting until children struggle with reading comprehension just sets them up for failure. This is the beautiful thing about reading comprehension. Once we understand that it's a language construct, then we recognize that we can actually measure it and treat it at very early ages, preschool, kindergarten, and so forth. As long as the language that we're assessing and the language that we're treating is in alignment with the academic language that they're going to be expected to understand when it's in written form, then we actually can make a pretty big impact on these children's lives and prevent the consequences of disorder and prevent the consequences of cultural and linguistic diversity and mismatch from actually taking hold. Clearly, it's much too late to bridge the gap in background and conceptual knowledge by the time you wait till third grade. So I'm going to talk a little bit about narrative language today, and we've used narrative language as our approach to measuring comprehension validly, and also to treat language validly. And part of the reason why is that narrative language is considered a bridge between oral and written language. We have this beautiful work from Carol Westby, who's essentially outlined this. Judith Johnston, they've outlined this idea, Ron Gillum, where narrative language reflects written language. And narratives are very relevant personally. You can see them across cultures. They may not all be the same across cultures, but the concept is there. And they are academically relevant because they require you to produce complex academic language. Narratives are authentic, they're ubiquitous, and they're incredibly useful. They require us to talk like a book. And if you can measure a child's ability to understand a narrative, then you're measuring their ability to understand essentially written language, even though that narrative is in oral form. Now, not all narratives are the same, but narratives can be shaped so that they reflect written language very easily. So in a multi-tiered system of support, which is what we've focused our research on, you need to have two major components in place: assessment, where students are monitored frequently over time, and then intervention, where tiers of intervention are applied according to whatever students need. I want to talk about assessment first. There's four essential elements: screening, progress monitoring, database decisions, and tiered intervention. We'll talk about screening first. So this is the idea of universal screening. Every student shows up on the first day of school or sometime around that time, and they're screened. Now, the traditional approach is to administer a static assessment. So let's talk about kindergarten students for a moment. Kindergarten students show up to school, and they're administered these static assessments that are related to reading or peripheral to reading: phonemic awareness, letter identification, rapid onomatized naming, things like that. If the students have not been exposed to those concepts or that content on the test, they can often do very poorly. This doesn't mean, however, that they really are at risk for having difficulty learning to read when they're older. It simply just could be a lack of exposure. In fact, in some situations, on a study that we just did a couple of years ago, we found that about 80% of Hispanic students are identified as needing intensive or strategic help at the beginning of the school year. With that kind of, with those sorts of results, there's not much that you can do. What do you do with that? Does that indicate to you that you need to do more intensive instruction with 80% of the students, more small group or individualized instruction? And how do you make that happen when 80% of your district is comprised of children who are scoring so poorly, who get these floor effects? Well, there is another way, and I'm excited to share with you this idea of dynamic assessment. Some of you probably are already very familiar with dynamic assessment, but I want to share with you the ways that we've applied it in our research. I really like this. This is an opening line from one of the Winnie the Pooh books. Here's Edward Bear coming downstairs now, bump, bump, bump on the back of his head, behind Christopher Robin. It is, as far as he knows, the only way of coming downstairs. But sometimes he feels that there really is another way, if only he could stop bumping a moment and think of it. Many of our educators and speech language pathologists and administrators are overwhelmed with the task that they have at hand. And they are doing the best that they can going down the stairs, but it does feel like often they're bumping their heads and they don't have the time to step back and reflect upon what's happening and if there isn't maybe a better way. We definitely have an advantage at the university because that's essentially our job, to step back and try to research different ways to do things. I think that dynamic assessment is clearly emerging as one of these alternative approaches to assessment that will essentially revolutionize the way that we screen children. We have a bit of a catch-22 at the beginning of kindergarten, for example. We know that early identification and prevention of reading is very key. And we would really like to identify reading disorders before they emerge, or difficulty with reading before it emerges. But how do you actually do that? How do you measure reading problems before someone can read? Well, dynamic assessment is an approach that actually allows you to do that. Dynamic assessment measures what a student is able to learn as opposed to measuring what they currently know. It's a very different construct. So I want to share with you a screener that we've put together called the PEARL, Predictive Early Assessment of Reading and Language. This came out of research that Dr. Spencer and I did several years ago, and it's ongoing research today. Its purpose is to predict future decoding and comprehension difficulty and to reduce that cultural linguistic bias that you see. It's a very simple concept. You essentially place these 4 nonsense words in front of a child at the very beginning of kindergarten and ask them to read these nonsense words. And as expected, they can't read those words. And if you stopped right there, as you typically would with a static test, that's all you have. You just know that the majority of students can't read. However, if you turn around and teach the children very briefly how to read these words, some very interesting information begins to emerge. So we ask the children, or we tell the children, this letter says t, say t. This letter says ah, say ah. This letter says t, say d. Put them together and you get the word t, add, tat. And we just do that with each one of the words. And then we have the children imitate us also in round 2. After we do this really simple teaching script with the students, we step back and reflect upon our experience briefly with them. We evaluate the errors that they made, the confidence that they had during the teaching process, disruptions that they made, their rate of learning, and then we just make this judgment of their overall ability to learn how to decode. After that, we give them a post-test, same words, just in a different order. Takes about 3 minutes, certainly less than 5 minutes to administer to each student. And we've done this work where we've followed 800 kindergarten students from the beginning of kindergarten to the end of 5th grade thus far. From the beginning of kindergarten to the end of 1st grade, we had about 90% accuracy in predicting who would have difficulty with decoding at the end of 1st grade. And we compared this to the static assessment that was administered at the time. And you can see that sensitivity, by the way, is how well a test accurately identifies people with the disorder. And specificity is how well the test accurately identifies individuals without the disorder. You can see that specificity is quite low here with your static measure because it's essentially over-identifying. It's telling you that way more students have a problem than they really do. We broke this down also by Hispanic students and found 100% sensitivity and about 75% specificity with the dynamic assessment. And you can see the specificity with the static measure is incredibly low because essentially 80% of the Hispanic children are identified as at risk. We've replicated this across other locations as well in Arizona, and these are the results that we get. So we're hovering right around 90% accuracy out to the end of 1st grade in predicting future reading difficulty. And we just analyzed the data out to 5th grade, and you can see that these are the sensitivity indexes that we got from the PEARL over here on the left and DIBELS, our static measure, on the right, and then also the specificity. So you can see that, in fact, these data are a little bit misaligned. It's a little bit higher than this, actually. We went back and did some regression analyses and found that if we analyze the dynamic assessment a little differently, we get even higher scores than this. But you can see that the dynamic assessment, because it tells you how well a child will learn something, it is much more predictive of how well they will, well, no surprise, learn how to read when they're older. This is the same sort of, same information, yet just for the Hispanic students here. So we also have a dynamic assessment that's connected with the Pearl for comprehension. So on one side of the coin, we can predict future decoding difficulty, and on the other side, we can predict future comprehension difficulty. And the way we do that is fairly simple. We ask the children to listen to a story and then retell it. And here, we're moving into, well, clearly this is what I think has a lot of ecological and construct validity, measuring a child's ability to understand and produce complex academic language through narration. So they're listening to a story which has academic language in it and complete story grammar elements. And then as they listen to it, or after they listen to it, we ask them to retell it, which indicates to us that A, they understood what they heard, and B, by retelling it, they can produce it. And we measure in real time how well they include story grammar elements and these key language complexity features, primarily subordinating conjunctions, which indicate complexity of language. So after we do this pre-test with the children, asking them to retell a story, we turn around and we teach them how to retell a story. We use pictures, then we use just icons, and all the while they're retelling the story and we're supporting them. And then we take away the pictures and icons and we still provide assistance to these students and help them learn how to tell a story. It takes about 7 minutes or so. And then once again, we reflect upon our experience working with these children. We ask ourselves how difficult it was for them to learn narrative language. And we put it on a scale of 0 to 4, from difficult to easy. And we do a post-test with a different story. We measure their ability to learn how to retell narratives. Our data for the language, we don't have 800 students in the studies, but in the studies that we've done thus far, we have almost 100% accuracy in identifying children with future reading comprehension difficulty through this process. And I want to share with you a website. This is diamondassess.weebly.com. It's free to go to. And we have our dynamic assessment on this website. We're piloting it right now. And it provides you an opportunity to download the dynamic assessment of narrative forms, which can be used for school-age students, not just kindergarten students. And then it has an opportunity for you to enter the data that you collect from your students, and we can use that in our psychometric analyses and normative process. So please feel free to go to this website and use the diamond and provide feedback to us. We really encourage that. Okay, so just a little bit more about assessment, and then we'll move into intervention. Let me just check our chat room here. See if we have any questions I need to address. So one of the questions is, I'm one of Trina's friends. What's the research say on subordinate conjunctions and complexity? Since these sentences are long, would mean length of utterance be just as good a measure of complexity? That's a great question. This is from Noé. Well, so the research on subordinating conjunctions is actually pretty robust. I did skip some slides. I took them out where we had some work that's reported to us from Carol Westby, Carol Strong, Marilyn Napold, where they have analyzed the language that you get from narratives and also analyzed the language that's in written language. And one of the common factors is elaborated noun phrases, temporal and adverbial subordinate clauses. So they're very indicative of complex academic language. And instead of asking teachers or anyone actually to identify a left-branching temporal adverbial subordinate clause, we instead just ask them to listen for a subordinating conjunction like after or when. The question of MLU is a great one, and MLU actually is a bit more of a gross measure. It doesn't get you quite the information that you would get from a more detailed analysis like subordination. And MLU doesn't seem to hold up very well, especially as a marker of language impairment once you move past 7, 8 years of age from the review of research that I've looked at. And it also entails some analyses that you don't do in real time, which we can do with the listening to subordinating conjunctions. And even if our examiners have a difficult time listening for subordinating conjunctions while the child is telling the story, they can audio record it and just go back and listen to the story. The stories that the children retell take only about 45 seconds to a minute. And so there's not a lot of time involved there. So while at the same time, we're absolutely looking for these valid measures of language, we are simultaneously trying to keep things very efficient and simple so that they can be administered to students across the districts. Or just in your caseload as well. It doesn't have to be shared across the world if you don't want to. But we're encouraging you to get out of your closet and share this with the world. And I'll show you here a couple of things that can benefit the students with disabilities as well as students across an entire district. So we talked about this need to monitor language progress and to do it validly. And I hope I don't get in trouble by highlighting some of the ways that our wonderful educators are currently measuring comprehension. I don't mean to be demeaning in any way, but I do feel like this is something that speech language pathologists and my research partner, Trina Spencer, who's an applied behavior analyst, these are things that we really can bring to the table, right? This ability to measure language validly and efficiently. So the cubed assessment is free to download. You just go to languagedynamicsgroup.com. And at languagedynamicsgroup.com, you get to sort through some graphics that are beautiful on the web page, and eventually you'll get to a cubed free download page, and that assessment is there free for you to use. The cubed is comprised of 3 major sections. It measures decoding, it measures language, and it measures reading. And currently we have materials for preschool through 3rd grade. We're working on 4th and 5th grade passages right now. So the 2 subtests essentially of the cubed are the dynamic decoding measures and the narrative language measures. Now today I'm primarily focusing on language, as you noticed, but we also have tools in place to measure decoding using a dynamic assessment approach. So I don't have time to really go through the phonemic awareness, word identification, or decoding subtests of the cubed. But essentially what you're doing is you're moving through this assessment process, identifying the student's zone of proximal development, as well as what they currently know. It lets you know where they're at and where they need to go, and it helps you develop goals for your students. In the NLM listening, or the NLM, we have NLM listening and NLM reading. They're parallel subtests, except one measures a student's ability to understand and produce language that they listen to, and the other one asks students to understand and produce language that they read. I'll give you an example of the NLM listening. This is what the subtest protocol looks like. It's pretty simple. You just say, I'm going to tell you a story. Please listen carefully. When I'm done, you're going to tell me the same story. Are you ready? You read the story to the student, and then you ask them to retell it. Thanks for listening. Now you tell me that story. And as they retell the story, you are scoring for story grammar elements, receiving points 2, 1, or 0, depending on the clarity and complexity of their answer. And you're also listening for these subordinating conjunctions, because, when, and after. Those vary a little bit depending on grade. There's more complexity built into the older grade level passages. This one right here is a kindergarten passage. In addition to scoring the student's narrative in real time, or if you're nervous, you can audio record it and go back and listen to it for 1 minute. You also can ask students comprehension questions, and then also measure their ability to infer the meaning of complex tier 2 words. So we're not just measuring their static vocabulary knowledge, but instead measuring their ability to understand a word through inference. The final piece of this NLM listening measure is personal generation that you can elicit if you'd like. In this story, Scott fell off his skateboard. Tell me a story about a time when you fell down. And in this case, you record the student's story and then score it using a flow chart, which I'll show you. Now, back to our real need here, which is to measure comprehension and to measure language as well, right? Expressive language. This takes about a minute or so to administer. It can be administered to students across an entire school district. Our teachers and paraprofessionals and assessment teams can learn how to do this quickly and efficiently and validly and reliably. And the ecological validity, I think, is fairly patent, it's fairly clear. So in a story like this is sort of what it looks like. A child is retelling the story about Shane getting ready for school. And as he's retelling the story, it goes like this. This kid, Shane, 2 points for using the character's name, was getting ready for school because he was late and he couldn't find his shirt. He was getting ready for school, 1 point setting, and he couldn't find his shirt, 2 point problem. So then he asked his mom to help him find it, 2 point attempt, and she told him it was on the dryer as a 2 point consequence, and he got it, 1 point ending, and he was happy, 2 point end feeling. We also used the word because in the story one time. We calculate the episode complexity that the student produced. This happens after you've listened to the story. You go back and look at how many of these 2 point elements that are shaded that they included, in this case, a P, A, and C. So we look over here and find our PAC combination. They got 4 points. This means they included a complete episode. And we tally everything together. 12 points story grammar, 1 point language complexity, 4 points episode. Total score of 17. And what we have is we have benchmark expectations for fall, winter, and spring across the grades. We have parallel forms for this. There are 24 or 25 language listening comprehension passages and 25 reading passages that we can administer to the students at grade level. They're parallel and they're carefully equivalent. I can show you that. If you download the CUBE manual, which comes free with the download, you can see the pains that we went to make sure that we had parallel forms within the grade levels. This is a second grade story. You can see that it increases in complexity. There are 2 episodes in the story instead of 1. And all of it can be downloaded here at languagedynamicsgroup.com. This is the flowchart that we use to score students' writing and their listening. Students' writing and their personal stories. The reading is parallel to the listening. The only difference is that a passage is placed in front of the student. It doesn't have all of this all over it, just the words. And you ask the child to read the story. And then you time the student, but covertly. This isn't some kind of race. You ask them to read, you time them. When 1 minute is up, you mark where they got after 1 minute, but you allow them to keep reading. You really don't let them know that 1 minute was up. You just covertly mark where they got after 1 minute. You let them read the entire passage, and then you ask them to retell it. A first grade passage, NLM reading first grade passage, is equivalent in complexity to an NLM listening first grade passage. So it allows you to differentially diagnose if there's a problem and where that problem might be with decoding as well as comprehension. This is all available digitally in our Cubed Insight program, which is, I don't know, like the cost of Netflix or something. It doesn't cost hardly anything at all. And it allows you to administer the test with a tablet and score the test with the tablet. And then also the system will track the progress of each of your students over time and plot it for you. It will tell you how each student individually is doing, as well as it will tell you how your entire classroom or caseload or school district or whatever it is, at whatever level you're looking at, it'll tell you how they're doing across the different subtests, and it will identify for you which students need help with which areas, as well as the system will also group students according to their needs. So students who are having difficulty with decoding will be identified and they'll be placed together in a group. Students who need language focus, these are actually a lot more specific. It will say to you, these 3 students are having difficulty with basic story grammar elements. Focus on that with them. Or these 2 students are having difficulty with inferential vocabulary. Focus on that. Or these 3 students over here are having difficulty with phonemic awareness. Focus on that with them. So it will group your caseload or your classroom together for you. Interpretation is available in the manual. It tells you by fall, winter, spring, what the benchmark expectation is, who's at moderate risk, who's at high risk, and so forth. We also have norms from 4,000 students across the country, which are available in Insight as well. So the Cubed and Cubed Insight can directly inform who needs an intervention. It can tell you what needs to be taught and when intervention needs to be adjusted. And it's a pretty key piece to actually addressing the real problem that we have, which is measuring language. So let's talk about intervention for the next 10 minutes that we have. Okay? So we have done some research on a multi-tiered language curriculum. It's very easy to use and very flexible. Just highlighting again that really this is something that is multi-tiered because it's not, addressing language is not something that just our students need who have a disability. Addressing language is something that the majority of our students across the district need. So the parallels here are as follows. Oral language and receptive language entail this listening piece here, right? And on the written language side, it's reading. With expressive language, you have speaking, and then, of course, on the expressive side for written language, you have writing. Now, all of these are highlighted and primarily focused in Common Core state standards or in other state standards. If your state doesn't use the Common Core, it really doesn't matter. Your state will have expectations that are very similar to the Common Core. And what's happening is that students are expected now to understand and produce complex language all the way down into kindergarten with narrative and expository text. All of these pieces right here, which are in the Common Core, oral narrative language can address. With Story Champs, which is our curriculum that we've put together and researched over the past 10 years, there are very, very carefully structured stories that you systematically introduce to students, and those stories increase in complexity over time. There's engaging visual materials with icons and pictures, and explicit teaching procedures that are founded on research evidence. It's manualized, but it's also very flexible. We've introduced a manualized approach to help our teachers and others who are less comfortable with language instruction, but in the hands of someone who's more familiar with language intervention approaches, it becomes a very flexible tool for them to use. There are lots of different story levels, and the storybook outlines for you what each of those levels are that you can address, the different targets. We also have this in Spanish, this intervention. So just a couple of examples here. This is a level A story that you would model for a student, and then you would ask them to retell it. And you would help them retell this story. And at first you start out pretty easily, most of the time, and you can focus on whatever targets the assessment indicates that you need to focus on. Story grammar elements like character, initiating event, attempt, and consequence, and so forth. These linguistic targets here are vocabulary targets. Here's a level A story where it's engineered to help you teach inferential word learning as well as the story grammar elements in the story. The pictures and icons all are very simple, purposefully so. This isn't about picture description. These are iconic in and of themselves to just help students move along through the story. Each of these are systematically faded as you're working with a child in every session. So you start out with pictures and icons, and then in the same session, you'll remove the pictures, and in the same session, you'll then remove the icons. Here's a level B story. Things start getting more complex when your students are ready to expand their language and the complexity of the story grammar. You'll introduce them to level B. And level C, which focuses on causal words. You can see here that because is embedded throughout all of the stories. Here you have temporal connections, after and when. So you can identify what it is that children are having difficulty with in their assessment, and then immediately turn around and address that concern. Here you have modifiers, adverbs and adjectives. Here you can target multiple combinations like temporal and causal connections, or here you have modifiers and causality targeted together. You start putting the kitchen sink together and systematically increase the complexity of the stories that the children are asked to produce. And that is the key ingredient, really, that the students are actually producing these stories, including all of this complex language. And ultimately, students are asked to produce stories that have dual episodes with all of the complex language placed together. Now, these are scalable. It's not by grade. Story Champs is something that's used all the way up into high school with students. There are pictures, even for these dual episodes, that indicate each one of the main story grammar elements and the icons that are aligned. Story Champs is digital. It's something that you can use on a tablet or a laptop. It has all of the stories, all of the pictures, all of the icons online, as well as there's additional features that I don't have time to go into today, really, but you can elicit personal, or not personal, but fictional stories. And you also can do expository intervention. Since I'm just out of time, almost, I just wanted to just show you a couple of the other features here. There are master lesson plans in Story Champs, and this makes it very easy for our teachers, or for anyone really. They can identify what it is that the students need to work on through the assessment, and then and the assessment will tell them, work on basic story structure. And you just turn to page 4, and you'll find the master lesson plan that tells you what to do with basic story structure. It tells you, do this. Put the illustrations out in front of the students, read the story, and model for them how to tell it, and then help them tell the story with pictures and icons, and then systematically fade those scaffolds over time in the same session. There's videos that you can go to, and the links are here on YouTube. And you can watch videos of Trina doing narrative intervention, Story Champs with preschool children at the large group and the small group level. I think I'll move on here a little bit. I was just have a few slides here that show you some of the highlights of the intervention. And this really isn't some kind of kit that Dr. Spencer and I put together at the last minute, or in some sort of idea that we needed to put a kit together. This is really the culmination of our research over the past 10 years. There are transitional pieces here for writing, where students can draft their stories, and they can check the story's complexity and accuracy. This thing's on automatic here. And also we have take-home activities for the students and expository intervention. It's a multi-tiered approach, so it works across all the tiers. And as the students move up through the tiers, the intensity increases. The tragedy here today is that I'll have to skip a lot of our research. However, we have conducted well over 30 empirical studies thus far on this narrative-based language intervention approach. And we've done this research across all 3 tiers: individual intervention, small group intervention, large group intervention, and so forth. And I know that I would love to share all these data with you, but we're essentially out of time to do that. I would like to leave it here on something like this, where we did a large-scale randomized control trial with almost 1,000 students. And you can see that the students all began essentially at pre-test at the same level of their ability to retell a story. And then after a few weeks of intervention, mostly large group, just 2 times a week, 30 minutes a session with the teacher, the majority of students in the treatment group made significant gains, and those gains were significantly higher than students in a control group. and students in a treatment control group who did a shared storybook reading intervention. That was for oral narratives, and the other graph over here is showing the results for expository language. Even though the intervention was oral language focused, we had gains in expository language. And these graphs aren't particularly easy to read. I apologize for that, but the results are meaningful. The red here indicates where students were at. The red and yellow indicates students who were at risk at 3rd grade at the beginning of the school year. This is our treatment group here, and this is our control group down here. You can see that they're pretty much the same as far as students at risk for having difficulty with reading comprehension. This is after a few weeks of oral narrative intervention. Students here in the treatment group, there are a lot more students who are not at risk and a lot less students who are at high risk, whereas here in the control group, you have very few students really who are not at risk. These students were followed longitudinally in the treatment group and the control group, and the students in the treatment group had significantly higher reading outcomes on the state assessment as well as on a MAP assessment, which is a reading assessment that's third party. And the students started out the same, but after just a few weeks of oral narrative intervention and a multi-tiered approach, they had significant gains across very meaningful outcomes. So the possible reality is this, that with a focus on oral narrative language, we can actually assess children's language validly and efficiently across an entire school district. And then we can also identify specifically what those students need and address their needs in a multi-tiered approach using oral narrative intervention and also expository intervention that I really didn't have time to go into today. All we're talking about here is actually identifying the problem, language, and addressing that problem in a valid way. And I'm really thankful that I've had the opportunity to share with you this research. And please feel free to contact me at my email at dpeter39@byu.edu or contact Trina Spencer at trinaspencer@usf.edu. We're the researchers who have put this together, and I really want to emphasize that really this is a research-based approach, and we continue to research it today. For any information about how to obtain any of the products, please contact michael.petersen@languagedynamicsgroup.com, and he has discounts in place for people who attend the webinar. Just a couple of seconds here, I want to address a question. There was a question on, that says, on Pearl, are there summer benchmarks for students who are about to enter kindergarten, or are there only fall benchmarks when students are in kindergarten? For the Pearl, this is a question from Christina. For the Pearl, we have data from students who are at the end of preschool, and we have data for students who are also at the beginning of kindergarten up to about November in the kindergarten year. Those are the students that we've been able to administer the test to and then follow longitudinally to predict future reading difficulty. And so the benchmarks or the cut points apply actually for those late preschoolers and those early kindergarten students. Okay, well, thank you so very much. We're out of time. And please, please don't hesitate to contact me or Trina if you have any questions. We're here to help you in any way that we can to implement this approach to actually helping our students understand what they read and be successful in school. So thank you very much.